So just at a very high level, in case you aren't as familiar with Inscribe, we're a virtual community platform. So we create spaces for students to connect with peers, faculty, and staff anytime, anywhere. And we have a particular focus on non-traditional students. So whether they're learning online, maybe commuting to school, have lots of other activities going on in their life, adult learners, we know they have some unique challenges that they face. And so when we designed Inscribe, we really designed it with that student population in mind. And the reason that we did that is because for students who are learning online, and I'm probably like preaching to the choir here because I know a lot of you already work with these students and probably are more familiar with me than some of the statistics and notes that we have up here. But what we've learned through our time, and I'm sure you have as well, is although these students come, many of them with a very clear mission for why they want to get their education and why they want to get their degree, the reality is they have tons of other things going on in their day. Kids, parents, work. And although education is a priority, it's not the only priority that they're carrying with them. And so we have to figure out ways to meet them where they are in order to support them a little differently and a little more dynamically, maybe than a traditional student who's on campus. The other component of that is that amplifies some of the challenges that we're facing is that learning online can be quite isolating. I know institutions have worked very hard over the past few years to create learning environments that are more dynamic in terms of, collaborative work opportunities, the ability to meet people inside the classroom. But still, when you're learning online and studying at home at night, you run into a problem or you start to get confused, it can be really easy to feel like I'm the only one that's really struggling with this. Or maybe I need help, but I don't even know where to go when I need help. And so how do we overcome that feeling of isolation, create better connections for these students? And again, we see that really in the retention rates for these learners, which are much, much lower than for traditional students. So you've got somebody coming in, they're motivated to get this degree, they have too many other competing priorities and they leave, and often they'll leave with half of a degree completed, but now they've incurred some kind of debt along the way. So it's almost like they're worse off than they were when they started. So our whole focus at Inscribe is how do we create better outcomes for non-traditional learners so that they can succeed in their degree and when they move on into their career. I know, Danielle, you had mentioned that this was a path that you took also as part of your learning journey. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about just personally how what this experience was like for you as a student.
Yeah, so I was a non-traditional adult learner with a very young child at home. He was probably 6 or 7, 5 or 6 at the time. And at this point, online learning was not a huge thing. And so I would go on campus one night a week from 6 to 9 p.m. I'd spend a couple hours there connecting with other people that had very similar experiences as I did. At the time, I would say the benefit in going in person was that I would get to connect with, the people around me that also had children. I
Yeah.
did get to see that, there was an older gentleman that was in real estate in the classroom and had older kids at home, and other women that also had children at home and they were doing homework at soccer practice or ballet practice and things like that. I did at one point later on in my journey take an online course. Was not for me, did not work out very well for me, unfortunately. I'm going to be super authentic in saying that. And simply, I just felt a little bit lost and confused in what was all expected. I'm a very visual learner, and so being in front of somebody and the instructor telling me exactly what their expectations were was super helpful. And I can tell you now, as I look back, in the moment when I did online learning, I don't know that I would have reached out and said, like, hey, I think I need some peer connections, right? Because I didn't know at the time that that's what I needed. But what I had learned through kind of looking back at the online experience versus the in-person experience is I know 100% that I would have rather had the in-person experience, but it was super hard to juggle, getting kids to where they needed to be and a full-time job and school. And I lived in California at the time. And let me tell you, traffic was not great and getting from all those places at the time.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. And what I was just thinking about there was that how it was a really good representation of what community is, which like at the macro sense, we can look at statistics like this, and we will look at some macro statistics throughout the conversation today about challenges that students face and problems that we can help solve. But what it really comes down to are these individual stories of learners, and how I chose the online modality because it was the one that was going to be most convenient for me, but I didn't know how to find my community as part of that. And so we'll also talk a little bit about these individual stories and how they come together to build up to these awesome outcomes that we think we can help you achieve. So, I think you spoke to this a little bit, Danielle, which is when you're running an online program or when you're running programs for non-traditional learners, community doesn't come for free. And what I mean by that is students probably are not, all students are not going to figure out how to do it on their own. Some of them will, and some of them will do a great job of that. They'll create a Facebook group or something else. But because students are so busy, because they maybe are feeling a little like what we've learned, for example, as adult learners have the highest percentage of imposter syndrome. And when you have a high percentage of imposter syndrome, you are much less likely to reach out and try and build connection with people because you feel like you're the only one, right? So you have this ecosystem of people. So it's kind of up to the institution to create mechanisms that bring these learners together in a way that feels really natural, really easy to do, really dynamic, and not necessarily putting the onus on them. And so that's a lot of what we try to help people do, is not just give you the technology to think about how do I, create this offer for my students, but in terms of implementation, the dynamics, what does it take to bring students into these spaces and have them thrive? I'm not going to talk a ton about this slide, but the things that prevent students from connecting can happen at all different levels, right? They can be things that are personal to me. They might be things that are happening in individual classrooms. They might be things that are happening at the program or institutional level. So recognizing that it's a dynamic, that the dynamics of belonging and connection are complex is important. However, after I say that, the solutions are actually quite simple. And single solutions can be brought to bear that impact all of these different areas. So that's a lot of what we're going to look at today.
Katie, one thing I would like to add is that you
Yes,
can't tell
please.
somebody they belong, right? And we've talked about this in other webinars as well. I can't say, hey, Katie, you belong. It's something that somebody has to feel, and everybody feels that in different forms of fashion, different ways. And so when you see it there on the screen, it's really as an institution thinking through like, how can we make sure that everybody feels like they belong, just from different learning perspectives or from different personality types as well.
Yeah. Yes. And so that makes it complicated, right? We've got all different people with different self-identities, and we have to create space for all of them to feel like they can be part of that. So we sat down and we really wanted to think about if our goal is to affect change for this population of learners, what are the key tenets that we want to focus on that we believe will help us achieve that goal? Like, what is our theory of change as an organization? So I'm going to walk through that really quickly, just so you understand where we come from in all of the work that we do. It's going to be slightly different maybe than some other organizations or companies that you speak to. And I think it's important to know like what's at the root of the work that somebody is doing. So first and foremost, Inscribe will always be human first, technology enabled. We believe that the human connections that students form, whether it's with your administration, your faculty, the other students at your institution, are core to what is going to help them succeed. That doesn't mean that we do not embrace technology. It doesn't mean we don't believe there's a role for AI in the world that we do. In fact, we already work with it, but we never want that to be replacing wholesale the human interactions that take place in our platform. There may be other examples and other technologies where that is appropriate and valuable and really where you want to go. But when you think about community building, you really want to preserve the integrity of the human relationship that's taking place in there. And there's 3 reasons for that. So one of the things that we are always seeking to improve is question asking behavior. This is pretty simple, right? When I get stuck, do I have the understand, do I have the confidence to raise my hand and ask for help? And do I know where to go for help? But I think if you step back and think about it, there are plenty of people, adults included, who never really learned this behavior, that feel like question asking is shameful or embarrassing, or but then think about who you would want to hire and have on your team, right? You would want somebody who would come to you and say, I don't understand this, or I'm not as certain about this, or I have an idea here. So how do we foster that? And that's one of the things that the community can do, because it normalizes the idea of question asking. When you see that everyone else is asking questions, and maybe you get the chance to participate in that process, it becomes something that's just innate and part of your skill set. The second is sense of belonging, and we'll talk a lot about that today. Feeling valued and accepted. That's very difficult to do in an online environment when students don't have access to each other. So simply by creating that access and creating visibility into who else is in your program and the opportunity to connect with them, students will start to build that sense of belonging. And we actually have a really cool study that we did that we'll talk about in a bit, where we specifically measured this as an outcome of the community implementation. And the third piece is social capital. I think we would all agree that when you go to school, the academics and the information that you're gaining in the classroom is one component of the value of your journey. But the network that you build, the people that you meet, the support systems that you start to put in place, that's also a really important part of the education experience, and one that you also take with you into your career to benefit you over the long term. Again, when you're learning online, you don't have access necessarily to all the people and resources that might help you build that network. And when you're coming from an underserved community, oftentimes you didn't have the opportunity to build that before you got to school. So for us, we believe it's critically important that the community also functions as a network building system. So you can meet people, understand who you can go to for help when you need it, and then carry that network with you when you leave school and beyond. So those are, I should say, 4 key focuses that we always think about, and I think you'll see those throughout. So are there any questions about that? Has anything popped up in the chat, Danielle, that I should address?
I don't see any questions at this point. I'm still trying to get through where everybody is coming from. So I appreciate everyone taking the time to introduce themselves. I did just drop a reminder in there. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will answer them live.
And I welcome any feedback on this set of core tenets as well. If we're missing something, if you think about these things differently, if you don't think this is a responsibility of your institution, like that's all great feedback. Feel free to drop your comments in the chat. I'm also just happy to chat, like set up time and learn from you after this.
Because we
But this is
encourage
an
the
area where
question.
we'd love to explore. Sorry?
We encourage the question. So there is a question in the chat now.
Oh, okay, yes.
Sometimes you just have to stop and ask, right? This is from Brittany in the audience. She said, I love your point earlier, Danielle, about belonging. To that point, can students create their own groups and discussions, or is it structured by the institution?
That is a great question. So I'm actually going to briefly answer that now, and I think you'll also see as we move forward. It's a 2-phase process. So initially, the community is designed by the institution, but it is then sort of turned over to the students to drive the conversation. So yes, students, if you want to give them the ability to create their own groups, they can do that. That's kind of optional. In terms of driving conversation and topics, that's a huge part of what the platform is designed to do, is really to let students talk about the things that they want to talk about and drive the conversation where they want it to go. So we'll look at how that's done in a minute here. I think I didn't include the slide on topics, unfortunately, but I'll just speak to it. So we try to have a nice balance there. Like, we want the institution to be represented in the community because we want students to appreciate it as an extension of their learning environment. This isn't Facebook. This isn't Discord. This is, something that you want to bring a little bit more of your formal academic self to. But it is a space for you to talk about what you want to talk about with your peers, to ask the questions that you need to ask, and to feel safe in that space. So part of our implementation will be to guide you through that process to create that perfect balance for your learners.
Thank you.
That was like a half and half answer. So
More to
let's talk
come.
a little. So today we're going to talk primarily, or almost exclusively, about the idea of a peer community. What I mean by that is it is a co-curricular space. It sits above the classroom. It might be at a program level, or often it's even at an institution level where you bring all your students together and give them a space to talk to each other. We also do other types of communities. So maybe you have an academic community that's focused specifically on math, or you have a advising community, which is really run by the advisors. So those also exist and have value. But today, just for time's sake, we're going to talk about this particular use case. Reach out if you want to go deeper on one of those others. But this is a place, as we've said before, for students to come and connect, not just with each other, but often you'll have your staff members in there. You can have alumni in these spaces. When you think about who is my community, right? It's probably bigger than just the folks that you have active in the learning environment right now. So you can think about how big or small do I want to make my community when you implement. Your community is meant to be a safe space. So there's things that we do to help it stay safe and healthy, but really having it integrated into the tools that you're already using, making sure you're controlling who is in the space, and then setting up the norms for the community really help with that. And we'll talk in a minute about the idea of a community as a knowledge repository. So it's not just a social space, it's also a place where knowledge is being generated and shared and redisseminated across your population. As you might imagine, it touches on all three of the key things that we think about in terms of helping students be more successful. So I don't need to reiterate these. I think it's probably self-explanatory, but again, ask questions, feel like you belong, and build your network. If we can accomplish those three goals, we will help students succeed more frequently and more often. This is a little bit of a outlier in terms of the slides, but I wanted to talk about it just because community isn't just about the technology that you use, it's also about how you implement that technology. We're not going to go super deep on here are the key things about how to launch your community. That's a little bit of a separate conversation. Most of you should, or all of you should have received a copy of our guide to community building that we just released, where we do go quite deep in that guide on these tenets. If you haven't received that, we're going to post it again as part of this webinar. We'll send it to you in the follow-up email. But one of those tenets is about meeting students where they are. And the reason I want to talk about it, just mention it here, is that that is fundamental to building community for non-traditional learners. They are busy. They have stuff going on. They are in different places at different times. So your community literally has to meet them where they are. It has to be technology-based, has to be integrated into the tools that they're already using, has to be available 24/7. You have to honor the flexibility of time and location if you're going to honor the value for these students. So always be thinking about that when you're creating your community. Okay, so what are the core elements of a community? Two of the core elements, which I'm actually not going to show, but were asked a question earlier, are the idea of finding my group and the idea of knowing what topics are being covered in the space. So in your community, you'll probably have this organizational construct where the information is organized by topic area. You already know what topics are probably relevant to your students. So use that as a way to organize the infrastructure of the community so that it makes sense to them when they get there. They can see really easily, like, where do I want to jump in, or where might I find the answer that I'm looking for? Once you've established that, there's kind of three main elements to most communities, and certainly to how Inscribe works. The biggest one, the one where most of the activity is taking place, is the conversation space. This is very student driven. So your students are going to come in and they're going to have questions. They're going to want advice about stuff. They're going to just want to share information about themselves. And so your conversations area is where that is really actively taking place all the time. In these peer communities, because we always get this question about moderation, who's moderating these spaces? How does that work? In a peer-to-peer space like this, your moderators are probably you should have moderators from your institution. So let me first say that. It's important to have staff members that are active, that are, who have some ownership over the space. And they'll usually come from maybe your coaching or advising team or your student success team. Kind of depends a little bit on the institution. But the good news for them is, in a space like this, less is more. You really the more that you post in the space, the quieter your students are going to become, because they're going to feel like this isn't actually my space to have conversations. This is a place for you to just push information to me. So it's better for you to kind of sit to the side, remain a little bit quiet. And then if a question comes in from a student that another student can't answer, or was very clearly something that, the staff would want to jump in on and provide a solution for them. But it's really more about observing and learning than it is about actively generating content. Questions, Danielle? Anything I need to touch on?
We don't have any questions in the chat. I think there was just a comment at one point about introducing students early on in their course. This person had shared that they sent out an email to a group and intentionally had everyone introduce themselves, and the faculty member was not in that introduction. And so what I really love though is the intentional, like, I'm going to create a space for you all to introduce yourselves and connect with each other. And in this case, they did this by email, but it was very intentionally done, and I really appreciated that.
I love that. So I don't know who shared that, but thank you for sharing that. If any of you have ever had dinner with me at one of our events, you know that I am the queen of icebreakers. I do not believe in sitting down for a meal without some kind of introductory icebreaker. And I will tell you that I feel like people at our dinners have made friends for a lifetime based on the stories that were shared in those conversations. So something as simple as introduce yourself, tell me a little bit about yourself can go a long way. And that's a perfect connection to the slide that we're looking at here. Your community
An
can be,
additional question in the
oh
chat.
yeah.
So when you mention less is more, is it best that we don't post more than 5 topics, or how many topics do you suggest are posted?
Good question. So the topics themselves are really just organized. They're like tags, right? So you might have coursework, hello from home, and then the students are generating conversations underneath those topics. I don't think there's a limit, but I would say usually to start your community, somewhere between 5 and 8 topics is traditional. We will actually, if you were to work with us, recommend to you what those topics should be based on our experience, but then that would totally be customizable based on your own knowledge of your students. And then what's cool about the communities is they're flexible, right? They're designed to evolve over time. So you might start with 5 topics, and then based on what you see happening in the community, nobody's using this topic, so we probably don't need it anymore. This one clearly has a lot of attention. Let's break it down into a couple of different things. And that's really what your customer success team at Inscribe is also helping you do. They're watching the community with you and making those recommendations on how the community might evolve as you move forward.
I would just encourage anybody that has any questions to drop them in the chat. You can also send them to me directly if you'd prefer that way as well.
So lots of things are going to happen in your community, but there's kind of 3 main buckets where we see the activity taking place. The first is what we were just talking about, introductions. It is so simple, right? The idea that as a student, I'm going to come in and just say, hi, I'm Katie, I'm from Colorado, I have 2 kids and 2 dogs. But then think about how powerful it is that that person who may have only met 20 other people this semester now has the opportunity to meet 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 other learners who also have 2 kids and 2 dogs. It's sort of replicating that space that Danielle was able to get by going in person in the evenings in this digital capacity. So introductions are very common. Icebreakers are encouraged. The other is the idea of students sharing personal stories or seeking advice from a more social emotional perspective. Your students are going to have moments where they feel overwhelmed, or they feel like they can't get through it, or they feel like they want to share something exciting that happened, and having the community available to them for that means that it's one thing to sort of share that with your advisor, because your advisor is going to give you great advice back. They're going to help support you through that. But it's different to share that in a community and have peers who maybe are living that same experience as you jump in to provide that support and feedback. I just like, I want you to conceptualize that for yourself, like how different that feels when somebody can say, me too, I've been there, done that, I've gotten through it. So this is an enormous part of what happens in the communities. And again, is sort of why that human to human connection is so important to maintain in these spaces. And then the last is just sort of tactical stuff. Students are going to ask, where do I find this resource? Or who took this class? Or, how do I fill out the financial aid forms? Those kinds of practical questions that students have that might seem really rudimentary. I don't know, that might not quite the right word, but they may not know where to go to ask that question. Honestly, there's so many different organizations on campus that they might simply be stuck on, like, I don't even know where to ask this. So the community creates a centralized space where these questions can be asked. So it just lowers the cognitive load for students. Like, anytime you need help, come here. Somebody will be able to help you or redirect you to the location where you can get that help. To that end, I'm going to go to the next one and then come back. You want to think about your community as more than just a social space. Think about your community as a knowledge repository. So there are lots of social tools out there, many of which I use myself, where it's like sort of the infinite scroll experience. You jump in, you see what happened in the last 5 minutes or 24 hours, and then you jump out again. But if something happened 3 days ago and you go and take a look, it's like it never happened, right? It scrolled off the page and it's almost impossible to know that it was there. You don't want your community to be like that. Every conversation that's generated in your community is valuable knowledge that your students are sharing with you and with each other, and you want everyone to benefit from that. So there's easy things that can be done. One is we have a search feature. So if a student searches for something, it will look across all the content of your community and help redirect them to where the answer might be. And if they even start to ask a question, Rosie will pop up. So Rosie, if you're not familiar, is our technology assistant that lives in our communities and helps out. And she will actually redirect the student back to where Rosie thinks that conversation is already happening or that knowledge already exists. Why is that important? Well, number one, now this student is not waiting around for somebody to answer, which might take an hour or 4 hours or a day. They got the answer they needed right away. And it's one less question that you have to answer. So if you're answering that same question 5 or 10 or 100 times every semester, answer it once in the community, get the knowledge out there for everybody. And now you're freeing up your inbox and your time to do other higher value things than sort of repetitively answering these questions over and over again. So that's a key component of community. Yes, it's about belonging and connection, but it's also about efficiency and time savings for you.
We do have a question in the chat, Katie, and I think we're possibly going back to the way that Rosie was flagging. Yes, and so the question is, do you review comments and conversations to identify students who may be in need of more formal interventions from academic or student support staff? Or are the conversations in the communities private within the membership of each community? So two-parter there.
Two-parter, yes. So the conversations are private within the community, meaning, I guess if you're a student in community A and you're not a part of community B, you can't see what other students are doing in community B. So you do have some control over that. But you as an institution would have access to all the communities and you'd be able to see everything that's happening. So we don't conceive of the communities as excluding you, the institution, from knowing what's happening in there. In fact, we think it's very important for you to know what's happening in your communities. But we also have a couple of tools that help with that. So the other thing that Rosie will do is we have a list of keywords. One of those keywords ever pops up, Rosie will flag it and alert you. And that's customizable. But the more interesting thing Rosie does is she runs the conversations through a sentiment API. So if the emotion of a conversation starts to get angry or frustrated or even confused, Rosie will recognize that and escalate that to you and the moderation team. So you can see this flag here. The student actually doesn't see this flag, but you would, and you can come in and make a decision about what to do. Is this actually a totally fine, maybe Rosie caught something that wasn't as urgent as you thought. Maybe it's a student that needs you to pick up the phone and call them and just have a one-on-one conversation with them. Or maybe they just need an encouraging word from you. So we really are about helping you identify those priorities within the space as well.
I'm trying to remember if we already covered the slide regarding integration or not. There was a question that was sent to me privately about integrating into an LMS.
I did cover it, but I didn't cover it with very great detail. So yes, Inscribe would integrate into all the LMS key LMS products out there. It also can integrate into your portal, your websites, your mobile app. It's not uncommon for there to be multiple access points to your community. The key will be we're going to talk to you about what you're using and where those integration points should live. It's kind of like the more the merrier. The more times you can get in front of the student, the more likely they are to join and participate. So really quickly, I mean, I spent a ton of time on conversations because that's really a core component of the product. Let me see how we're doing on time. But there are two other areas that you can think about that are helpful in the community. One is the resources area. This really speaks to that knowledge repository component. You as moderators can add supplemental resources to your community, whether they're short videos or links to websites or articles that you've written. I would say generally speaking, most people we work with have some folder of these things sitting around somewhere for students, and we just help them represent them in the community so they're a little more accessible and dynamic and easy to access. The other piece, which I love, is this idea of live events. Now, I realize that I spent a lot of time here talking about how asynchronous is important, meet students where they are, and I believe that very deeply, that you for this population of learners, you have to lead with an asynchronous environment. But live events are also really important, and I'm guessing most of you do some version of this, whether it's a guest speaker that you have coming in, or a meetup that you're scheduling for folks, or a study, event. And you can bring in and promote those events through your Inscribe community as well. And what's cool is then, they're scheduled, students can attend them, but if they can't make it, grab that recording and add it back to the community. And it's another way of extending the life of that event and welcoming more individuals into participation than maybe you would have been able to otherwise. Did you guys want to say anything on live events? I was going to touch on it quickly, but.
No, I think that the neat thing about Inscribe is we have a very um, communicative group of clients that work with one another, that talk to one another, and we learn from them. So it's been really interesting to see how they've used live events over time to drive engagement, get students more active, to drive more connection between online students and the institution as a whole. So we found that they're quite valuable.
Awesome. And then of course, analytics. We do not hold your data hostage. We are one piece of all the amazing things that you're doing for your learners. And so we want to make the data not only easily accessible for you to know what's happening in your community, but available in a way that you can combine it with other data so you can really understand the impact of Inscribe among all the other things that you're doing. So this is just a quick snapshot. We could probably do a whole session on analytics and data, but just know that that is something that we are very, has always been core to what we want to do and what we want to offer. And when we look at some of the outcomes that our partners have presented, we'll see how we really partner with you to understand the connection between what we're doing and the outcomes that you're seeing for your learners. All right, with that, so I just inundated you with information about why community matters, how communities can be designed, some of the core elements. This is the more fun part where we really talk about what some of our institutions have been doing and the outcomes that they saw. Anything you want me to touch on before I dive in, Danielle?
Not at the moment. Let's go.
Awesome. And we may have some of these institutions in the audience today, so I welcome them to jump in and add their colorful commentary as well. So I'm going to start with Rio Salado Community College. Some of you may know Rio Salado, really large community college down in Arizona. Actually started as an exclusively online college, so the vast majority of their students are still learning online. And like many community colleges, they have students who are coming and going, who are stopping and then moving on to other programs. And so it was really difficult for them to wrap their arms around the full student population and help them feel a connection with each other. And so that's why they came to us and partnered with us. And we worked with them to launch Rio Connect, which is a institution-wide student community. So every student has access to this, and they access it through their Rio Learn portal or LMS. They happen to have a homegrown LMS system, so we integrated into the system that they're using. And what Rio did, which was really neat, and actually a few of our partners have done this, is when they were designing the community, they brought the students into that design process. So they brought their student leaders in, they helped figure out what topics do we want to have in here? What's the purpose of this community? How are we going to communicate about it? And then they helped run that community once it launched. And the results were absolutely amazing. First of all, because we sometimes hear from people like, well, adult learners are never going to participate in this. The average age of their community participants was in the 50s. So like adults love this stuff and they're very active. But we also did a formal research study with them around concepts of sense of belonging and peer connection. And you can see some of the results here. I'm sure Danielle is going to drop this thing in the chat if she hasn't done so already. So read that study. I don't know if we shared, there's an executive summary and then there's the deeper study. But what was cool is this was really only the impact that we saw was after just 6 weeks. So we didn't have to run this community for a year or 2 years to get the benefit. They ran it for 6 weeks and already their students were reporting this much greater feeling of like understanding each other and feeling like a connection to the institution.
I did share the executive summary in the chat. I also just got distracted because Sasha's on the call, and she said she recognized this case study, although she didn't say where she was from. So I'm gonna call her out. Hopefully she doesn't hate me after this, but Sasha is our friend over at Rio Salado.
They're an amazing partner. Shout out to Sasha. And they're doing, I should say, we talk about this one use case, but they have expanded their use of the community in lots of other cool, different dynamic ways. I'm sure we'll have a webinar just with them at some point this year, so keep your eye out for that.
And Rhonda, quickly, there's a
Oh,
question. Rhonda asked if we'll be sending out the recording of today's webinar. The answer to that is yes.
absolutely. This next one is from Fort Hays State University. So they are in Kansas. Our friend over there, Andrew Feldstein, would probably be super annoyed with me for saying this, but they're a more traditional state school, meaning they have a fairly significant in-person population, and a big online population. I think online is actually larger than their in-person population. But we're facing some of the similar things. They ran a series of studies during COVID and asked their students, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And one of the interesting things that they learned was while the in-person students reported really high levels of like, I feel disconnected, I can't stay motivated. This is so much different than what I'm used to. All the online students were kind of like, business as usual. And Andrew, to his credit, could have looked at that and said, oh, our online students are fine, no worries. But actually what he saw in that was, oh my gosh, there's this disconnected environment and our online students are just used to it. Like they don't expect anything more than that. And so we owe them something. So we partnered with them. We launched the Tiger to Tiger community, very similar to Rio. It's an institution-wide community. All online and in-person students have access, and it's through their Blackboard portal. Something unique that Fort Hays did was rather than do a big splashy announcement about the community, they really just let students kind of find it organically. So their growth of their community happened a little bit more slowly, but it was done in this really interesting and authentic way. And now it's thriving, also very much run by student and student leadership organizations. We see good participation from both the online and the in-person students, which is interesting. And think about this as like two populations that would probably never talk to each other if they didn't have this place to do it. And the studies we've done with them have repeatedly show students are find value in the space, feel better sense of connection and peer engagement, very similar to what we saw with Rio. This post is sort of a classic that we like to talk about where somebody jumped in and, took the time to be vulnerable and share some of their anxieties. And within an hour, there were, I don't know, how many do we have there? 12, 15 responses from other students saying like, I'm here for you. Do you want to form a study group? Let's get together. We're in this together. So it was like the perfect articulation of what you want your community to be. Okay, third example is the University of Maryland Global Campus. For those of you that aren't familiar, UMGC is an enormous global university. They serve a huge population of military learners. So they have students literally in every time zone around the world. They do have some in-person instruction, but the vast majority of their learning is done online. And these are students who really have very limited time, might be moving around a lot, might need to come in and out of their learning depending on what's happening. And so they also felt like they were missing this opportunity to have the students kind of connect with each other. So they took a slightly different approach. So we partnered with them and they launched their initial community out of what's called their PACE course, which I don't remember what that stands for. I don't know if Danielle does, but it's essentially the introductory course that all students take coming into the program. And it teaches you about learning online. So it's like, it's not just the nuts and bolts of the LMS, but it's really about what's going to self-motivate me, study skills, things like that. We have the luxury, because they're so large, of having 8,000 students worldwide active in this PACE community. And the students just took off with it. So they were in there sharing advice, introducing themselves to each other, building relationships. It also allowed faculty to come in and interact with the students. So although the faculty were not required to be in the community, they were drawn in. And I don't have any quotes here, but the sentiment, the feedback that we got from faculty about their experience in there was extremely positive, which is always a great thing. But I'm bearing the punchline, which is in just a semester, we saw a 13% increase in the number of students successfully completing this course, with a huge increase in the number of A grades and a 2% increase in persistence rates. And 2% out of 8,000 students, we're talking about a lot of learners who are now continuing on in their education journey who otherwise might not have. So this was a huge success, and we have since rolled out communities across the entire institution at UMGC just based on the outcomes of this. I think Danielle will share all the case studies with you guys as we go.
This one's not quite finished yet, but we will make sure it's in everyone's inbox in the next.
Okay, we're just getting final approvals.
Yeah.
And then our last example is Talon to Talon. And I'm going to pause here because I also want to just reflect on the schools that we've talked about, right? A large community college, a more traditional state university, an enormous online school, a big school serving Hispanic and minority underserved learners. So they're they're certified a Hispanic serving and minority serving institution. So these are very different institutions. On paper, the students that attend these schools are very different, but they ultimately all face the same challenge and use the same platform to achieve positive results. So UNT launched similar to UMGC in their student orientation and onboarding. And this was just blew us away. After one term, we helped them improve the persistence rates in their students, among their online students, by 13%. So haven't even done the math to know how many learners that is, but it is incredible. And so we are rolling out to a much larger population of learners there. Also, kudos to all of these institutions, because the work that they put in to really promote and launch and support these spaces is part of what drove the positive outcomes that they saw. So these are a few examples. We can go deeper on all of that, but we just wanted to share those so you could understand the diversity of folks that we work with, and also sort of across that diverse group of people, the commonality of the challenges that they face, which I hope resonate with some of you, and also the commonality of the positive outcomes that we're able to achieve. Before we go, though, we want to talk a little bit about ROI. So communities are not free. You're making an investment here. So we want to make sure that you understand what positive outcomes there are for the institution as well, beyond simply helping your students. And so I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Sure.
to
We'll
lead.
give Katie a break as she's getting a cold and grab some water. But so as Chief Revenue Officer, I think a lot about return on investment. And when I think about Inscribe in particular, I just quickly, I think for the schools that use us, we're really, really reasonable in comparison to the return that our customers see. We saw that in the data points that Katie just presented. But I think part of that is not just because we've got a great platform purpose built for higher education that drives super high adoption and engagement rates among students while driving positive outcomes. But so much of the impact is because what Inscribe is really good at is tapping into this really valuable asset that most institutions have, which is their community, their students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and taking that community to drive positive outcomes for learners. So it's big piece. A piece of it is Inscribe, but most of it is really being able to put that broader community to work. So when we look at what institutions gain, student retention and engagement, we saw the data that Katie presented. Brand reputation and boost. When I think about online programs and having done this for nearly 20 years and working very closely as online educate with institutions as online education has evolved, we were for so many years focused on marketing, enrollment, what programs are we going to offer, what's the tech stack that we're going to use to support those programs. And oftentimes institutions, particularly those that had both a residential and online component, forgot about how do we take the culture, the community, the experience that our on-campus students have and extend it to the best of our ability to our online learners. And I think the programs that are growing at the highest rates, that are seeing students come back to that institution to upskill or to support a career pivot by exploring, by furthering their education with that same institution, or helping institutions increase their net promoter score as a result of this really good experience that students have. I think now schools are seeing the light that we need to focus on community, focus on student success, giving them as much of that experience that our on-campus students have. The data, and Katie already talked about this, but the data in Inscribe is this layer of data about your students that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's all exportable. You can pull it into a data warehouse and layer it on top of data from your LMS and other sources to be able to get a really nice multi-dimensional view on your students, who's contributing the most, who's not engaged, who's involved in the communities. Cost savings and efficiency. So we talked about it a bit as well, being able to scale your administrators, scale faculty, make it easier for them to focus on the learners that need the most attention. For most of our schools, they see a double-digit impact on the burden, the administrative burden to faculty. And then finally, by creating an environment where students engage with their institution, where it's not just transactional, where they feel like they're part of a community, they're more likely to give back to that community. As I mentioned, they're more likely to further their education over time through that experience that they've had. So they feel like they're part of your institution, and it's not just transactional. If we go to the next slide, just very quickly, when we look at our cost versus enrollment revenue, tuition revenue, for public and private four-year institutions, it usually takes retaining a student or two to be able to pay for it. We understand that we're in uncertain times. And for many institutions, they don't already have a platform like this. It's not like we're replacing an LMS. It's something that's net new, but it is looking at the impact that we've had at other institutions. It's something that's easily justifiable. And even for a community college, retaining 5 students will cover the cost of implementing Inscribe. So with that, I'll turn it back to Katie as we get close to concluding.
Hey, Katie, you're muted.
You are still muted, Katie. Sorry.
I was like on a roll. Thank you. So, the cool thing about community is it's got this outsized benefit for what is essentially a small financial, and whether that's working with us or with somebody else. I mean, we conceptually love this. We want people to implement it no matter what. But you really you can make such a big impact with something that is not super complicated to do. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, we just published this guide that talks about our the fundamentals of how we believe community can and should be launched, and what we've learned over the years of doing this in terms of what makes a successful community implementation. So if you haven't read that yet, please download it, take a look. Again, I think they're best practices that can be applied in lots of different ways, but of course, we'd be happy to help you directly as well. And, to that end, I would love to stay connected with you. I tried to connect with as many people as I could on LinkedIn before the event, but time was not in my favor, so I will connect with the rest of you afterward. But you can also reach me through email or through our website. If you're really thinking about this at your institution, just schedule a couple of minutes to talk to us. We are happy to kind of explore what challenges you're facing or what opportunities you think this might bring to bear, why it's a priority for you. And we can give you some really honest feedback about what we think would work for you and for your learners. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So appreciate you spending some time with us today.